Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this very interesting panel on measuring women's agency in contraceptive decision making. As soon as people settle down, I'd like to start the panel. We have four very interesting presentations today, and what we're going to do, the format is I'll introduce all the speakers, they'll come one by one, present, and in the end, I'll bring them back and probably we'll have a more informal panel discussion, and we would really love the audience to participate. So this panel is actually coming out of diverse research studies, but being hosted within the umbrella of uh, an Indian consortium of organizations that we call the FPMLE consortium, which is 5 different organizations that have been working together and include one of the presentations today, that they've been working together to really test and design new measures of reproductive agency in a way to kind of challenge very, very existing mainstream and often prosaic measures that we've been using for women's decision making. Many of you know that almost for 40 years we've been using fairly singular methods. However, in the last 5 to 10 years, maybe there's been a real upsurge of the desire and to test and embed new measures and learn from more grounded theories around ideas of reproductive agency and autonomy. Part of that is that we know that the measures we've been using, such as joint decision making in household purchases or going to the market or small purchases, often lend themselves to fair amount of arbitrariness by the researcher who has to assign what to do with joint decision making, whether really that confers power to women and agency to women or not. So today in this presentation, we're going to keep unpacking and delving into some of those issues. And this arbitrariness is also lent itself a little bit to invisibilization of power and relationships. So a lot of the measures that we've been previously using or we oft use that actually determine the designs of policies and programs in family planning actually may have very little to do with women's individual, relational, gendered, and powered lives. So this panel today is hopefully going to go a few steps further to help us unpack. But of course, this is a large space that we have to continue to work. Part of the problem is that there is actually multiplicity of new measures and frameworks that are getting grounded in different and diverse settings, as these studies will show. But when you look at what's being used in kind of mainstream large surveys, such as the DHS, we haven't kind of infiltrated what we are doing here with this kind of space at the meta and macro level. But today we also have researchers who occupy and straddle all of these spaces. So idea is to start also advancing the discussion as to where do we take this? How do we take some of this and embed it and take it to scale? Part of the critique of some of the traditional measures, as I said, are fairly absent of understanding power and also kind of more invisible negotiations that might be happening in relationships and such as what's happening with traditional method users. Do they have agency and control, or is it a demonstration of power and patriarchy? What is happening with covert use? What do we know about abortion users? So there's a lot we don't know, and all of what we are talking about is still in the context of heteronormative relationships. So how do we also extend these frameworks and measures to other kind of partnerships and relationships, especially amongst young people? So I think not all of that will be answered today, but the idea is to start provoking all of us to think differently and be a little more disruptive. The more disruptive we are, the more destabilizing it could be for what is conventional approaches. But as you're listening and hearing in different streams of this venue itself, there's a lot we don't understand and quite know about contraceptive decision making, and it's going to come to fore as we introduce new methods such as DMPA-SC, which will rely a lot on self-inject. And we will still be confounded with some of the same questions. Is self-inject really an expression of autonomy? What is the journey for that decision making? Or is it an expression of covert use? So the same ideas will keep getting reflected. So that's really an introduction to this panel. We have 4 presentations, as I've discussed, and I'm just going to quickly introduce all the 4 presenters, and then we'll go one by one. We have Dr. Jeff Edemids, who's a senior demographic and health research analyst at Avenue Health and the DHS program, and previously a colleague from ICRW for many years, who's going to talk about what do we mean by joint reproductive decision making, measuring meaningful engagement. Followed by Dr. Tanmay Mohapatra, who's a team lead of CML, Concurrent Measurement and Learning Department of the Bihar Technical Support Program of CARE. It's a program that the Gates Foundation India office has been working for the last decade with, and Tanmay is also a close colleague and member of the consortium. We have Professor Jay Silverman, who's with the Department of Infectious Diseases and Global Public Health and within the School of Medicine at UCST, and also a close collaborator and partner of several of the work that the foundation has been doing with you, Jay. So we are quite excited. You're going to, actually, I'm sorry, I'm not reading your presentation titles because they'll be read again when you present. And then we have Dr. Madeline Short-Fabik. She's with the Deputy Health Division Bureau of Africa, USAID, meeting you for the first time. Welcome. And I didn't introduce myself. My name is Priya Nanda. I'm with the Measurement Learning and Evaluation team at the India Country Office of the Gates Foundation. And as I said, some of these presentations are partnerships that the Gates Foundation has been fostering in India. So with that, we're going to bring Jeff over to you for your first presentation. And somebody will help you load that.
I think they'll adjust it for me. Okay, while that's getting pulled up, I'll just say thank you again for coming in. I think this will be a very interesting session for all of us. And I'll move as quickly as I can. It's going to be a lightning round through this because we want to keep it short for time for discussion. I should say that this work stems from a previous project that I had worked on prior to starting at the DHS program in Avenir, and really builds on work that I had done with colleague Laura Hinson, who's currently at the International Center for Research on Women. So really, I'm interested in what do we really mean by joint decision making, and then how might we actually measure that? And I want you to pay careful attention to this aspect of meaningful engagement, which I think is a critical component of what we have been thinking of in terms of decision making. So, why do we care about joint decision making? We care because we think it means something different than having someone else make the decision for you, or even having to make the decision completely by yourself. We think conceptually, we know that the ability to influence and make decisions is a really core component of what we think of as agency and empowerment, and that's both at the theoretical and at the practical level. If you don't have engagement in a decision, then it's hard to argue that you're empowered in that decision-making process. When we typically approach this, as Priya was saying, we often assume that the people who are reporting a joint decision, typically in a survey like the DHS, are more empowered than people who are not. And we often tend to assume that the joint decision is an ideal outcome, or occasionally lump it together with deciding on your own, even though I think in practice we know that there's a general preference for harmony and consensual decision making that emerges, but we end up lumping those two things together even though they may mean very, very different things. As partly, I think, a result of this kind of lack of clear linkage between the measure that we're using and the theories and the concepts that we're trying to measure, we find that the evidence linking decision making to improve reproductive outcomes is less conclusive than you might think based on the last 20 years of discussion about this in the literature. Part of that is in practice, as Priya already mentioned, we are relying on really simplistic questions to get at these issues that fail to take fully into account the nuances around how decisions are really made in practice. We all know that in our own lives, But when it comes to using these data, we take them at face value and move on. So these often also, again, Priya, you stole my thunder there, don't take into account power and the influence of power in relationships and what that means for how decisions get made. So let's think about the key components of agency and decision making. Power, obviously, the ability to influence others. It doesn't necessarily mean exert full influence over others, but you have the power to actually have some influence. Voice means your ability to advocate for yourself. Choice, which is really what we think of often as the piece of agency and empowerment that we focus on the most, is really about the ability to make and influence decisions that affect your life. And you can't have full choice if you are powerless and voiceless. So these things all work together to shape how we think of this. A key aspect of how we think about this is you have to understand decision making and agency and empowerment as taking place in the context of relationships. It's not doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's between an individual and someone else, or an individual and an institution, an individual and their doctor. All those can be thought of as relationships, and then within that there's different levels of agency and empowerment that shape decision making. So the framework that we've developed, and I have citations for the papers that these are drawn from up here, which I can share, really takes a sociological approach where individuals are embedded in a more kind of close social environment and a distant social environment, and agency shaped by the three components that we talked about: voice, choice, and power. And those interact in different ways at each level of this model to shape an individual's empowerment in any given situation. So if we're thinking of it from this perspective, then we really have to try and measure voice, choice, and power when we're talking about decision making, or we're simply not lining up our conceptual framework with our measurement frameworks. So if we're thinking of joint decision making, what is that? If we're going to really address this, we need to have all three of these components as part of our measures. We need to think of decision making as happening within the context of relationships and negotiation processes within relationships. I'm not talking only about intimate relationships. I'm talking about a relationship that you can have with an institution or a doctor or, your in-laws. But all of those are relationships, and all of those you can be empowered or disempowered to differing levels in each of those. So we really need to critically think about how inclusive, engaging, and equitable those joint decisions really were. What constitutes a discussion about reproductive decisions? How involved did that person actually want to be? Because we don't always want to be involved in every discussion. Were they able to express their opinion and have it heard? Like, not just say what they want, but effectively advocate for that position. Even if they didn't necessarily get their way, were they able to express voice? And were they satisfied with the outcome? Because we all know in our own relationships, sometimes we go into a discussion with one idea in mind for what we would like to have out of it. But during that time, we were free to change our mind and feel the process was fine and we're okay with the outcome. So it's not about getting what you want all the time. It's about engagement and meaningful engagement. So we developed, Laura and I developed this method really thinking of taking a mixed method approach to really trying to understand how kinds of questions might be asked, using a qualitative approach to develop more of a quantitative set of questions, which we then interpret in more of a qualitative way. And we use 5 core questions for each of these 5 domains of what we thought of as core domains of reproductive life. And essentially laying out what we had just talked about before, and this is paraphrasing somewhat, but was your opinion sought by your partner? Was that opinion, did you share your opinion with your partner? Was that opinion valued? Who had the final say in that? And how satisfied were you with the outcome? People may, for example, for strategic reasons, choose not to express an opinion because they can tell that, their partner or whoever the relationship is with was already heading in a direction that they wanted to go in. So why mess with a good thing? So don't say anything. That's an empowered choice too. So that's the issue, is that we can't conceptualize of empowerment only as moving us in a certain direction. For example, with contraceptive use, we can't just assume that use of modern method is the empowered outcome. Not using a method, as we'll, I think, thank you, as one of the papers that we'll hear from a bit later in this session, that's also, it can be empowering, or it can be disempowering, depending on the context of the relationship. So measuring these things is really important. So we combine this conceptual framework with qualitative and quantitative data to create, using these questions for each of these domains, 3 levels of decision-making profiles or agency levels. High agency would be those who had shared their opinions and felt it was valued, or didn't share their opinion because they didn't care, or already were in agreement with their partner, were the final decision maker, or it was joint, and were satisfied with the outcome. Then that's easy in some ways. You can say, well, that's easy. There's your high empowerment people. Then on the other side, you have the low empowerment group, who are those who did not share their opinion because they didn't feel comfortable doing so, or didn't think it would be valued, or they shared their opinion but felt that that didn't make any difference, were not involved in the final decision, and who wanted more influence than they eventually had and were not satisfied with that outcome. Again, that's kind of the 2 extremes are relatively easy to define. So what about the middle? What we did is we said, well, everyone else is in the middle. So we defined high and we defined low, and everyone else was in the middle. And we refined and tested this with, in 2 districts of Nepal, with men and women, though most of the results are for women. And really the results for women were suggesting that there was pretty high consistency within the questions, so the measures seemed to work and hold together. They related well to, thanks, to other expected demographic and social outcomes. And in contrast to what we were really looking at for different things, we also were measuring different things. We looked at feelings of reproductive control. So feeling that you had control over your future fertility and future method choice, and satisfaction with your reproductive life to date. So it's not about achieving a certain number, but it's more about, do you feel that you have achieved what you wanted? Are you happy with this outcome? And we then compared that with the more traditional style of question, and we chose the PMA 2020 style question, and found some differences there in how they were classified. They also can break down women into high, medium, low empowerment, so we compared them. And we found that a sizable proportion of women reporting as a joint decision for the PMA style question were classed as low agency in our measure, and that a lot of that came down to how this joint decision then filtered out for issues around satisfaction and engagement and the more nuanced parts of decision making. We also found that it really depends what area of reproductive empowerment is being examined and which outcome you're looking at. So there are some potential advantages to this approach. It allows for really explicitly the role of voice and power to be examined, and greater nuance in the measurement, captures more variation across different reproductive domains, is less reliant, we think, on researcher decisions in the line that Priya, you mentioned, applies to both men and women. And this is another issue that is being somewhat contentious, talking about men's reproductive empowerment and how men can be disempowered in the reproductive realm. And there's less agreement about that in the field. But this theoretical framework allows for its application to men. It's agnostic to gender and how it thinks about it, because it's about relationships. And again, the advantage is really it builds on 30 years of feminist literature about empowerment and decision making, and draws from that and a variety of different fields to try to understand and better measure this issue. And finally, I'll say, and this is something that I find very important, the key outcome here is not contraceptive use. It's much more about reproductive empowerment and satisfaction with that, and not about whether you use modern contraceptive or not. And I'll stop there for now.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. And I think I'm glad you touched on the subject of men because that might be a critique of the exclusion in some of the other presentations that we will discuss in the panel. And that was a brilliant presentation. Over to you, Dr. Tanmay. For people who've come late, Tanmay is from Bihar. He's with CARE, Concurrent Measurement and Learning Lab, and will be presenting some of the work that we've been working on with him in Bihar. Over to you.
Thank you, everyone, for at last getting the chance of talking to faces and making this decision to be here. Jeff almost set the path for walking into the particular direction to understand that what exactly happens when decision making becomes the point of ponder. And he kept it open for women, for men. Right now, I'm going to focus a little more on women's participation in decision making, especially related to family planning related aspects, and try to understand what are the different drivers of any change thereof. Background, we all know that the development of women's social, economic, cultural, and political rights are critical for achieving economic growth and alleviating poverty. India aims to achieve the goals, and for that, this equality becomes very important. Participation in decision making is one of the key indicators for measuring the empowerment, as it has been mentioned everywhere. And studies indicated positive relationship with many factors in that decision making. These we all know. Methodology based on the data that we will be presenting something more nuanced. It's not coming from a single study. Thanks to Gates Foundation's long-term idea of supporting implementation through proper evidence, there were 3 serial cross-sectional studies conducted during 2016, 18, and 21, which did identify different changes. And the last one in 2021, the third iteration of that 22,800 sample size multi-stage cluster random sampling, ending up in a state level sample of married women of reproductive age, had a subsample that is from those 38 districts that Bihar has. In each of those districts, there were 600 Anganwadis, 120 Anganwadis, and 500 or 600 samples selected. One of them had exposed to an additional questionnaire related to gender measures, what the man has to say, what the mother-in-law is actually doing in terms of that, as well as the frontline workers. Based on this methodology, we assessed the covariates related to all kind of FP-related outcomes, the proximal aspects to that, and then intrinsic, social, and normative factors related to the final outcomes. Let's see what data says. There are some changes in contraceptive use and method mix in Bihar. Things improved, everyone is happy, good, not a problem. But the interesting part is the change that happened over a decade, that percentage point of change actually got accelerated in last 5 years. So what happened between 2005 to 2016 actually had a further acceleration in terms of modern contraceptive use, in terms of some changes in the method mix. We all talk about spacing. It happens. Not much known whether knowing what is spacing. Maybe just because of that is eventual. Husband comes back from the migrant locations, etc. But still, the change, the increase in MCP that did happen between 2005 to 16 actually didn't have much contribution of spacing. But after that, from 2016 to 21, we have much more contribution of spacing method in that increase. Now the question is, what may have driven this? And the next question, do we understand that properly? Want to put women at the center? Married women, the age and religion distribution will tell you that this data is kind of methodologically and the population distribution wise quite credible. But things changed. The formal education, those who receiving formal education, that increased over time. The self-help group membership also increased with some dampening because of COVID later on. Decision making also kind of improved. You spoke of decision making, joint decision making. Now, who is actually making that decision when answering the survey question? That's actually something in the back of the mind. You are coming here to interview me, and I don't know what else you are going to do after that, and that also drives my decision. And that's why when we look at this, that 52% had the decision-making index actually good, we worry about the 26 more, that what exactly is happening in that poor part decreasing. So far, we were very happy. The poor decision making going down, the group who are making good decision going up, and then we actually wanted to understand the pathway of change and the role of intrinsic factors. We understood that there are several proximal aspects: improved literacy, increased age of marriage, exposure to media, and interaction with FLWs, frontline workers on family planning. Then there are some intrinsic factors. Many people will have all these. Does that mean that is translated into enlightenment and decision making? We have seen 30 years experience of teaching ultimately ending up to find out the wife or the son with certain specification as if it is the product. Now, improved self-efficacy, awareness on FP services, informed choices, these are something which helps in processing those information that is being ultimately provided. But again, think about her. She knows probably what to do. She probably wants to do. How can she do it? How can she make the decision? Interspousal communication came out to be a very important point. Balance of power, norms, negotiations on a family planning, and male engagement ultimately played its role in decision making. And interestingly, if there is a proper decision making in terms of joint decision making coming from informed, interspousal communication supported, some balance of power, ultimately there is a shift in practices from permanent to temporary, better uptake of FP methods, and reduction in unmet need and intended births. Time is always very short, so I summarize the slide in this one. Now, little more data to make us awake. Overall self-efficacy, when it increased, all the parameters increased. Self-efficacy was measured based on standard scales. We have the citations, and after that it was adopted for self-efficacy for use, for self-efficacy for decision-making, and then balance of power. Very tough thing to measure. I still think all the available measures are actually imbalanced. Now, the question is, are we measuring balance of power or imbalance of power? So the point is, we found it is tilted to male for most of the things up to the percentages that is evident. And multivariable logistic regression did show us that the women who felt more empowered, they also scored good in balance of power index, or vice versa. We don't know. Now, this is a complex pathway where Jeff actually asked me to work in. And it tells me that better interpersonal balance of power in relationship is actually predicted by better self-efficacy of the woman, which also helps in greater decision making, which again has a loop from the better interpersonal communication. Both of these ultimately end up in leading to unrestricted mobility as well as greater decision making. Now, we tested all these through multinomial and ordinal logistic regression modeling, adjusting for potential confounders, and we found quite strong odds ratios. In development sector, we don't generally see odds ratios of 5.9. Time is short, so I'm leading to the key influencers, all husband. We think of mother-in-law, we think of everything, all husband. And ultimately, it's almost unanimous. I initially wrote it is unanimous, then I deleted. That husband's opinion was reported to be most important despite the widespread perception about the mother-in-law's role. Some more odds ratios, ultimately individual and interspousal factors found to be strong predictors of better FP scenario. As we have seen, we have measured with balance of power, measured with self-efficacy for discussion, self-efficacy for FPUs, overall mobility index. And you can see the odds ratios that modern contraceptive prevalence, other than the balance of power, all are actually giving us a positive and strong positive association. So the conclusion, while participation in decision-making a positive predictor of contraceptive use, several intrinsic factors play its role. So supply, demand, availability, quality of care, they have to be there. But after that, let's think about the woman and see whether self-efficacy and balance of power, does he understand? Does he have that agency to exercise it, to negotiate through those normative pressure so that they ultimately can take decision, improve family planning related decision making, consequent contraceptive practices. It's a request to program implemented to focus on the self-efficacy so that we can better negotiate with normative boundaries to make free decisions. Now, let her decide. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tanmay. And we'll pick up some of the ideas that you've suggested in the discussion, especially because you're coming from the program. So, what are the program implications of this? It's easy to say, let her decide, but how do you really execute and design programs for that? So, with that, I'm going to introduce Jay to please come and for in case people miss the introduction, you can quickly talk about your work and then over to you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Try not to move around too much. So thank you, Priya, for the introduction. That's a wonderful panel, as Priya said. So we're here from the Center on Gender Equity and Health at UCSD. And let's see if that works. There we go. And there should be many more names on this slide, I realized. But today I'm going to talk about, this is all quite cohesive. Really looking at decision-making in terms of participation has been discussed, control in cases of disagreement, so sort of thinking about that final say that Jeff was talking about, as well as considering all of these things in the context of not just FP use, but use overtly and use covertly. Okay. So a lot of this has been discussed, the thinking about women's reproductive autonomy. There are multiple elements, of course, decision-making and control of contraceptive use are very big ones. We've talked about the single measure in DHS around participation that looks at, just husband and wife jointly, and just wife, and what does that mean? Alternative frameworks, and my friends Jeff and Laura here, looking at things like final say and level of satisfaction, but that has not been looked at nearly as much. We're just really, I think, starting to build the literature on that, and again, adding this additional element of not just looking at FP use, but really considering how women are using FP. They are making choices, they're not using it, but even if they're using it, they may be using it in a way that is private, and it's all very intentional, typically. I mean, there's a lot more work to be done there, and we've seen how much covert use lines up with gender-based violence and other concerns like reproductive coercion. So all of this we're going to look at in the context of rural Niger. These three main pieces, again, what's participation, what is control in cases of disagreement, so final say, and also, as Jeff mentioned, the satisfaction with their level of control over those decisions. Okay, so talking about Niger a little bit, many people, I think, in this room know that there's a very, very high rate of early and child marriage among girls in Niger, and also very, very high adolescent fertility. All of these things, amongst other things, contributing to high, not just overall fertility, but the maternal mortality ratio. Obviously, all of this is occurring within power structures and create power structures that very much shape, again, people have been talking about power, what really is her agency around making these decisions and controlling her reproductive health. Okay, as I think I mentioned a moment ago, we're going to be we're discussing a sample of married adolescent girls from the 3 districts in the Dosso region of Niger. This is these data are taken from the 3rd wave of a randomized cluster controlled study of a Pathfinders program called Reaching Married Adolescents. At 4 arms, obviously, we're adjusting for armed, and we're looking at cross-sectional data in this particular study. 823 married adolescents at the time of this 3rd wave. They were 16 to 22 years. They had all been married, though, under 18. Okay, and I talked a little bit about the sampling design. It's such that this is representative, at least, of married adolescents in those 3 rural districts. Okay, importantly, so we keep talking about measurement. So this is the, first off, participation. Who usually makes decisions about FP use? This is the one we're almost familiar with. Husband alone, wife with husband. Then getting to this final say or decision-making in cases of conflict, in cases of disagreement, who makes the final decision about FP use? Either husband or wife. Then satisfaction. How satisfied are you with the level of control you have over these decisions around FP use? So, and then in terms of FP use itself, I shouldn't say decision-making, this is, have you ever done anything? So we're including, non-modern FP use to space or delay pregnancy. And then overt versus covert. We have some much more nuanced data around this that have come out of many discussions, including those with Priya. But in this study, it's a simple, rougher version of, did you ever do something or use an FP method to space or delay pregnancy without your husband knowing? And that being equivalent to covert use, and people who said they had not done that were considered overt users. Okay. I will skip over this to get us here. So, in terms of thinking about participation, not surprising, as particularly for this sample, majority saying husband alone, and a little over a third saying joined, very few saying wife alone. Moving over to who makes the final decision, almost 94%. So really, it's basically, right, it's the husband alone. Those people who said wife with husband, none of them really made the final decision. And that's really important. I think I'm okay. So anyway, that's a very important point. Again, this joint decision-making, at least in this context, if there was any disagreement, it was only joint if he agreed. Right? What does that mean? I would say that women's rights are there as long as they don't, as long as they don't interfere with men's rights. Women's rights are, you know, wonderful thing. That's okay. So level of satisfaction. This was interesting, and I mean, and this is a less clear measure, but more than 2/3 of women reported being usually or always satisfied with their level of control. But no, satisfaction is a very complex thing. So this was all very exploratory. What does this mean in the context of contraceptive use? So more than half participants reported ever doing something around contraception, delaying or spacing. And of those, the majority were reporting overt use, only a small percentage in this sample reporting covert use. Covert use was actually decreased through this intervention because there was much greater awareness among men, and there were discussions about contraceptive use. Okay, very important. So, what did participation mean in terms of use and covert use? So, with the referent being husband alone, because that was definitely the largest group, we see that although there are no associations between participation and overall use, when we break down overt versus covert use, women making decisions alone, that was negatively associated, right, with overt use and positively associated with covert use. So these things are, you know, just again, pointing out the great importance of looking at these things separately. The joint decision-making, again, was somewhat associated with covert use and not associated with overt use. In terms of control, in cases of conflict, very clearly, the small number, right, of women who had control of those decisions in cases of conflict, you know, overwhelmingly we're talking about covert use, not surprisingly. And satisfaction, and this is interesting. So those who report being usually or always satisfied tended to be positively associated with overall and both covert and overt use, with the exception of covert use for those who are usually satisfied. This is much more exploratory. And quickly saying, okay, so what does all of this suggest? One, again, agreeing with what's been said here, it's important to assess FP decision-making in terms of final say or spousal disagreement, that this is probably really critical to clarify women's agency beyond any assessment of participation. Adolescent wives' participation and being the decider of disagreement definitely related to higher covert use, but not overt use. Again, you know, covert use is something that women use to cope with situations, right, where they have less control. Not all women have that option, but that's, you know, it's not done by in any random way. Women with higher decision-making agency may be more likely to exercise their agency in the form of covert use. I think that's a question that remains to be answered. And overall, just understanding women's agency regarding family planning use and other things really needs to be considered in the context of women's choices about how to exercise that agency in terms of overt versus covert use. Okay. Thank you.
So thank you, Jeff. And as you're seeing, we are complicating this idea of decision making more and more. And what's really interesting here is this high relationship between women alone deciding and covert use, even though only 3% of the sample is covert users. So it's really interesting what it's picking up here, and I hope we'll get to discuss it more. And then the last presentation, Madeline, is even more interesting because she talks about non-use and non-decision making, I think. So please, Madeline, over to you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. It is exciting to see faces and faces behind masks. So I'm Madeline Short-Babick, and I am presenting on behalf of some co-authors. Some of them are in the room, Apurva Jadhav, Lotus McDougall, and Anita Raj. And of course, as the disclaimer here says, this research is, reflective of our own thoughts and don't necessarily reflect the views of USAID, the US government, or any other organization with which we are affiliated. And so the question that we were interested in is the decision is the engagement in the decision not to use contraception an indicator of reproductive agency? Raise your hand if you think the answer is yes. Okay. And raise your hand if you think the answer is no. Okay. Spoiler alert. Our research, this study finds that yes, it is. Okay, we can wrap it up. No. Okay, let's see. So briefly, little bit of background. The family planning and broader women's empowerment field frequently examine reproductive agency through the lens of engagement in contraceptive decision making, which we've been hearing about for the last 45 minutes or so. And the question is the woman engaged either solely or jointly with her partner in the decision to use contraception? And this aligns with the ACT mechanism of reproductive agency as described by the CAN ACT Resist framework. What is rarely, if ever, examined is the relationship with reproductive agency and women's engagement or lack thereof in the decision not to use contraception. So this brings us to our central questions. Every 5 years, the DHS program goes through a core questionnaire revision process, and the 2014 core questionnaire revision allowed the DHS program to add a corollary question to the women's core questionnaire on decision-making not to use contraception. So the question is, and this question is asked to contraceptive non-users, would you say that not using contraception is mainly your decision, mainly your partner's decision, or did you both decide together? So now it's several years past 2014, even though time feels like a flat circle. It's hard to know what year it is or what day it is. We've got a lot of countries who have now collected data on this question, and so we were really curious to look at, are the data of good quality? Does this new indicator have utility? Does it have construct validity? And most of all, is engagement in the decision not to use contraception also an indicator of reproductive agency? So our data are from, the DHS that used the DHS-7 core questionnaire with final data sets available as of October 2021. And our analytic sample includes women of reproductive age who were in union and not pregnant at the time of the survey. We did not include men in the analysis, and this is not because we don't care about men, but actually the men's core questionnaire doesn't include these questions, so we can't assess it. This is a snapshot of the 30 countries included in our analysis. And this is a chart of our method. So I said there were sort of 3 sub-questions. We assess data quality by examining the prevalence of missing data on decision-making to use and not to use contraception. We assess indicator utility by examining descriptive data and response variation. And then we test construct validity by examining associations between both decision-making not to use contraception and decision-making to use contraception with women's engagement and household decision-making. And for that, we use bivariable scatter plots and multivariable linear regression models that control for age, duration of union, working status, household wealth quintile, urban rural residence, education, and parity. So now let us turn to results. All right, so first piece, data quality. Data quality is robust. Women are answering the new question on decision-making not to use contraception across all 30 countries. In 29 of 30 study countries, there were fewer than 2% missing responses, with one exception being Papua New Guinea, and I'll come back to that in a second. There were no statistically significant differences in missingness between responses to the decision-making to use contraception and the decision-making not to use contraception by country, except for Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and South Africa. But for Indonesia and South Africa, the differences in missingness were not meaningful, as less than 2% of the subsamples showed missingness across the questions. And then the differences in Papua New Guinea are really likely related to broader survey implementation issues rather than the decision-making questions themselves. So the Papua New Guinea survey actually was from 2016 to 2018, which is a very long time frame for a DHS survey. And it had multiple fieldwork implementation issues, and it actually had the lowest survey completion rate among eligible women among all DHS program surveys. So we're talking about more than 300 surveys. Moving now to indicator utility. As you'll see in this scatter plot, so it's maybe a little bit hard for you to see in the back. The x-axis is engagement in decision-making not to use contraception. The y-axis is engagement in decision-making to use contraception, and each dot is one of the 30 countries in our analysis. So what we see is that most women are engaged in the decision to use or not to use contraception. This axis, it doesn't start at 0, it starts at 60%. And they're engaged either solely, i.e. mainly respondent, or jointly with their partner. Mali is a big outlier here, with the lowest levels of contraceptive decision-making engagement of all of our study countries, and that's both for decision to use and decision not to use. You'll also see that in most study countries, 23 of 30 to be exact, a statistically significantly higher proportion of women engaged in the decision to use contraception than engaged in the decision not to use contraception. And in 6 countries, there was no statistically significant difference. Not shown here, most women's decision or engagement is driven by joint rather than sole decision-making, and that's the case for decision to use and not to use. So mostly this is a rehash of what I just said. Contraceptive users are more likely than non-users to be engaged in contraceptive decision-making. And in fact, averaging across all study countries, we see that nearly twice the proportion of contraceptive non-users were not engaged in the decision compared with contraceptive users, so 18% versus 10%, and sorry for the double negatives in that sentence. So these analyses indicate that this new indicator, decision-making not to use contraception, has utility. It provides insight. Next, turning to our third study aim, we find that as women's engagement in the decision not to use contraceptive increases, that's again the x-axis, their level of household decision-making also increases, and that's the y-axis. This mirrors the relationship that we observed between an engagement to use contraception and engagement in household decision-making. And generally, joint decision-making is most associated with household decision-making engagement. In no study country, I don't think this will surprise you, in no study country is women's household decision-making engagement highest among women whose husband or partner made the contraceptive decision. But interestingly, in a handful of countries, we see the highest household decision-making engagement among women who report other as the person who made the decision not to use contraception. Those countries are Malawi, Nigeria, Uganda, Sierra Leone, and Timor-Leste. And so this, for us, indicates that this contraceptive decision-making question among contraceptive non-users is measuring a different type of agency than the household decision-making questions. And then here's our multivariable linear regression models. And on the left-hand side of the figure, you'll see that women's engagement in the decision not to use contraception is positively associated with household decision-making engagement in 29 of 30 study countries, and that positive relationship is statistically significant in 27 countries. Only one country, Maldives, or actually, only one country shows a non-statistically significant negative relationship, and that's Gambia. And then on the right side, you'll see the multivariable linear regression model for women's engagement in the decision to use contraception, also positively associated with household decision-making engagement in 29 of 30 study countries, and it's statistically significant in 25 of those countries. Here, the findings suggest that the new measure of women's engagement in the decision not to use contraception has construct validity, and it corresponds with construct validity that we've seen in decision-making to use contraception, which is, again, frequently used in our field to look at reproductive agency. So implications. It's valuable to ask about the decision-making for both contraceptive users and non-users. Results align with our conceptual understanding of women's reproductive agency, which can involve agency in contraceptive non-use as well as use. And results recommend the use of contraceptive decision-making measures, both to use and not to use, in the context of reproductive agency, including not relying on household decision-making measures as a proxy variable. Of course, like everything, there are limitations. I'm out of time, so I'm not going to talk about them. But you can read them here. And, you know, really the study comes with, I think, 3 recommendations. First is that reproductive agency takes diverse forms, that with data already collected across multiple country contexts, this could be readily incorporated into a lot of different measurement frameworks, including the Sustainable Development Goals, which indicator 5.6.1, the proportion of women aged 15 to 49 years who make their own informed decisions regarding sexual relations, contraceptive use, and reproductive health care. This could be part of that measurement. And really, the findings support incorporation, you know, into our thinking about what family planning efforts in reproductive agency needs to look like in a broader sense beyond contraceptive use, which I think is coming through a lot in the presentations here and today's panel, as well as ICFP 2022. And with that, I thank you for listening, and are we going to move up?
Okay, sorry to be disruptive, as would be the nature of this panel. We just thought we'd make it a little more informal and have a little bit of a discussion with the panelists. But I don't know whether we have hand mics, so we may have to go back to this seating. Just give me a sec. So we do. Okay, so I just want to thank everybody, and I think if nothing else, people would leave this session at least questioning the measures that we've been using and oft relying on around contraceptive decision making. But there's much more here that we'd like to discuss. I'll come and sit next to you. So if you don't mind, if I can just get a show of hands of who have questions. Quite a few. So what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to open it up first to your questions. Be brief with your questions, please. Address it to the panel, whoever. And then I'd like to end with one round of questions from me to the panelists. So if you don't mind, you can come into the mic till we get a hand mic. Just step out. Come to the mic in the aisle. Be brief, please, and address your question so we can get more out of this panel discussion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm Ayla Tobo, Save the Children UK. I had a quick question for Madeline regarding your research. Thank you for sharing that. It was really, really interesting. You talked in your multilineal regression about some socio-demographic differences. I think you accounted for that. My question was, did you account for contextual environment, i.e. social norms, enabling policy environments, particularly with regards to women deciding not to use contraception? The second question close to that is, I wasn't clear if your sample of women deciding not to use contraception were never users, previous users, or both. So if you could, thank you.
Hi, thank you. Adnan Khan from RADS Pakistan. So a lot of food for thought to take away and mull over in the days to come. But one comment, actually, there's an intersectionality here of collectivist versus individualistic culture. Agency means a lot of differently, and when somebody says it's my decision or our decision, the line between that is not quite as distinct in collectivist culture. So it's just this comment. Well, I mean, so no, I mean, so these are 30 countries in some studies. So there are, I mean, even when I'm doing stuff in Pakistan, I mean, there are places where you'll find collective cultures, and there you'll find very, very individualistic households. And answers to that, when you start unpacking with some qualitative work, come out very differently. Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking that should we actually have measures of that in, yeah. I don't want to put the panel on the spot. I mean, this is incredible work that's being done.
Hi, Khadija Esker. This question's for Madeline on the idea of non-users. And I think of non-users from different buckets, right? And so one is people who aren't using contraception because they are intending to get pregnant, right? And there's then another bucket of non-users, which is, are they people that might be wanting to use or not and aren't using for various reasons? And so I'm wondering when you did the analysis, or maybe future analyses, how you might parse those out. And so if we're thinking about agency, essentially users thinking about non-use in terms of agency for what, right? Like agency for pregnancy versus agency to prevent pregnancy, how you would do that analytically.
If you don't mind, we'll stop at 3, do a very quick. Two of the questions are for you, Madeline. Go ahead, and then if anybody wants to answer or get an answer.
Okay, thanks for these questions. I think I got them. So for social status, all of the data are from DHS, so there isn't that type of, more nuanced, like the studies in Nepal that you all were describing or the like, because these are standard core questionnaires implemented around the world. So we tried to incorporate it where we could, but it's not as specific, I don't believe, as maybe what the questioner was intending. When it comes to user status, so the way that the questionnaire flows and the skip patterns flow is that it's in-union women who are not pregnant who report that they are not currently using contraception. They are then asked the question, is the decision not to use engagement question. So that we could, if we wanted to further explore, we could further disaggregate that by never users and former users, but ultimately the analytic sample is just women who are not currently using contraception. We talked a lot about disaggregating by fertility intentions, and we sort of struggled, I think, in that space because we had a similar thought of wanting to look at that. We first did it by unmet need status, but we don't like that as an individual level measure. It's a population level measure. And then we thought about unmet need in that way, though, because there are so many different elements as to, fertility intentions, including perceptions about infertility, frequency of sex, et cetera, et cetera. So I feel like my answer is a yes and for that question.
Does Does anybody right now want to reflect on Adnan's question? Otherwise, we'll actually talk about this whole cultural context and what you don't capture. I mean, I think that's an important question.
I think the distinction that you're making between how we have conceived of decision making, whether it's truly an individual factor, how people think decisions are made. But I think that there's a question of the question around satisfaction with that engagement allows for some of that. So it doesn't, the idea of empowerment is that you have the choices and you're able to express your voice if you wish. It doesn't mean you always do that. So in cases where, a collectivist approach may be what a woman wants, it's not necessarily a sign of disempowerment that she hasn't directly engaged. But that's more if you're looking just at that relationship. I would say if we take a step back and think of empowerment writ large, then you're talking much more about what are the structures that have put in place a decision-making system that doesn't encourage, at least engagement by this woman potentially. And so I think that it's important to distinguish between like the more micro level and the kind of structural level ideas around empowerment. Sort of the difference perhaps between agency in the decision-making process and actual empowerment.
And just want to add one sentence to what Jeff said, that is it at all also required to have that kind of absolute demarcation between it's my decision, it's his decision, it's our, is it at all possible? Everything is within that 50 shades of gray, right? The point is, if she wants something, what environmentally, means social and familial environment, and what other kinds of driver-wise barriers she has to overcome. Because decision making is not that linear. We all talk about, she said that we'll come with the cultural aspects later. She may be actually not wanting because she wants to get rid of that kind of comment that she cannot give birth to a male child. So it's not always decision in that sense of decision, a multifactorial component, as you rightly said.
Very, very quickly.
I also want to say
Yes.
that we should not focus on singular measures
Yeah.
to be capturing the whole gamut and complexity of decision making.
Well, and related to that, I think, a lot of what we're talking about trying to understanding relates to social norms. So certainly thinking about something like satisfaction, it has to be embedded, right, within the understanding of the context of social norms, which is a whole other, new area of measurement. I think that, we're struggling and trying to find meaning in. But anyway, just wanted to add that.
So please go ahead. And Aurobindo, you also want to start. Go ahead and then you take phone. No.
You can start. Thank you very much. Hello, I'm Aurobindo Mojumdar from Population Council, New Delhi. I'm looking for a small clarification from Professor J. Silverman from your presentation. Sorry if it's very trivial, but still, I'm referring to the slide that we presented, that covert versus non-use, and it was coming out like 3.2 odds ratio among the group where we have the decision has been made with husband and wife. My question is, if it's a covert use, how that husband and wife can make the joint decision? So that's my question. Thank you.
Hi, Tim Shen. I run a consultancy called Shankot Consulting. Just firstly say this is a fantastic conversation and a really important one, and I want to join in the critique on joint decision making, because joint decision making we often regard as the most equitable approach to decision making, and I found in my own research in Malawi that joint decision making basically meant men making the decision, and I also found high rates of covert use, but which potentially led to significant violence. And so my question really is, how do we operationalize this from a male involvement perspective? And I felt very challenged about this, because on the one hand, as an advocate for a long time on male involvement, men are clearly making the decision. But on the other hand, often women have to access methods to protect their own reproductive rights and autonomy. And especially what I found at the health system was that the way in which the health system operated involving men was actually to reinforce men's power, to bring men into the conversation, but actually in a way that reduced women's agency. So I felt like it was a real conundrum. So I guess my question to you is, men are clearly involved in decisions. They should be involved, but how do we involve them in a way that ensures that we still uphold women's rights, but protects the fact, I think it's too simplistic, I'll be honest, to say that we should let just women always be able to access the methods as they want, because men can find out and then it can lead to violence, and that is certainly what I found in my own research.
Christy from Children by Choice in Australia. I guess my question was fairly similar around, I guess, what the difference is between empowerment, disempowerment, high agency, low agency versus reproductive coercion and control, and the intersection with domestic and family violence, and how all of those things could be seen as the same thing. Like low disempowerment, low agency can actually be a symptom of fairly significant reproductive coercion and abuse. And is that the same thing? Yeah.
Dr. Nandita Bhan, and she's with General School of, you can introduce yourself. That's fine. As well as UC San. Yeah, so okay, just take the
Yeah, very quickly. I think what you point out there is the inadequacy, I think, of that participation measure, and sort of what Tim was saying, like joint participation tends to mean he's making the decision. I think Tim's question is tremendously important, and this is something there are many conversations going on around. Men, it of course can be a positive thing for men to be involved, but the only way to do that, from a rights-based perspective, certainly from a women's rights-based perspective, is that that's her choice, whether he is involved or not, and that needs to be assessed before we're just bringing men in to those decisions, because of course it is not in the interests of many women's reproductive health and autonomy to bring men into those decisions. Under other many women will want to bring them in, but she has to have a choice over that. Tim's point about that potentially leading to partner violence and conflict, it may, but it still has to be her choice. We're not going to know better than she does whether that's a wise strategy for her or not, right? It's simply a tool that she may wish to use or may not wish to use. So we certainly shouldn't be forcing people to use covertly, or to not do it. So again, thinking, this is about us supporting her autonomy with additional options.
Yeah, Jay, you can, I can contextualize a little bit. And Jay, if you want to talk about repro coercion. I was only going to contextualize some of this within the work that we've been doing in India. So I think Priya introduced this at the start. I think I've been very privileged to be part of a group of organizations called the Family Planning, Measurement, Learning, and Evaluation, FPMLE Consortium. And the idea of the measures work in India has really been to kind of unpack the user journey, particularly using an agency lens. We understand that contraceptive decisions are often not, when we talk about women's empowerment, we often talk about, I think as one of the questions came up, a slightly more individualistic perspective. But when we look at actually decisions that happen in play, we're really talking about a relational aspect, and that is where power comes in, be it relationships as in couple relationships. And we are only talking about heteronormative sort of a perspective, but still we're talking about how those power relationships play out. So some of the work that we've been doing, that Tanma has been been part of testing, has really been about incubating new measures, new innovations, and unpacking what are the different sort of perhaps steps on that user journey. And it's not to say that we've been always successful. I think we've had challenges in terms of conceptualizing it, be it from a qualitative lens or even like testing it out. Sometimes measures don't work in the fields in the ways that we think that they should. And sometimes they really throw up new surprises. So for example, in India, for example, we're having a really tough time measuring covert use because reporting of covert use is complex. Women often, when they're reporting that they're doing something that their husband doesn't know or their family doesn't know, often feel like they're doing something really wrong in telling you that they are. So it's not easy to sometimes report some of these things. And sometimes when questions are asked, we've often found that in the ways that field surveys are conducted, we often find that your mother-in-law is standing right there. So how do you report that you've been using something secretly without the knowledge of somebody else? So there are all these sort of conceptual implementation challenges, and I think our work has really, it's been sobering, but it's also really helped us push the boundaries a little bit. So I just wanted to talk, sort of contextualize some of this conversation. So for example, one of the important things that I think, Jay, you and Jeff, you also pointed out at the end of your presentations is really moving the outcome away from modern contraceptive use. So the outcome is about choice. The outcome is about agency. The outcome is about covert use. So things like that. So sorry, I'm going to stop there, but like I just wanted to just give a little bit of contextual framing of this work and where it's kind of come from.
Just, I'll be very quick.
No, don't leave.
Okay.
We have time. We have time.
But what I want to say is we're going to actually end the panel because I can see people moving. So we're going to just ask one question to all of you. And Jay, you can respond. My question really is the so what of this, right? So we have a host of new measures embedded in new frameworks, different contexts, with a lot of challenges of what they can do or do not capture. So what is your wish list of the next step? And what would be where and what kind of influence would you like to bring to either a program or to further research on new measures? Okay, and then whatever you're going to say.
Okay, I'm going to very quickly say something about reproductive coercion because you asked me to do that. So reproductive coercion is basically, it's a measure, it's asking women about, it's a series of questions asking about whether women are being coerced or forced to be using contraception, not using contraception, becoming pregnant when they don't want to, being forced to have an abortion or being kept from having an abortion when they don't want to. And what, very interestingly, we're talking about, like what Nandita was talking about happening in India, reproductive coercion in places where there is great access and acceptability of female-controlled methods is actually related to greater use, and where there is less acceptability and access to female-controlled methods, like in India, it's related to less use. And anyway, there's many implications there. The programmatic piece, and that I think we should all be focused on is, again, how does this help us understand and support her choice, whether it is to use contraception or not to use contraception? What are the ways that we, at the community level, in the clinic level, can, support, enable those choices? And when she is, dealing with conflicts, in the home, in the community, again, how can we give her tools, perhaps, again, that facilitate her making the decisions, exercising decisions?
So just two small points. Number one, we are talking about many things, all coming from right-based discussions and all other stuff. But why we need family planning? Whose benefit it is going to bring? The whole family, right? Let us talk about the health layering of family planning. In the program, if we talk to men, and when we are talking to men, thinking them as an agent of change, thinking them as a partner, and thinking them as a client, and having all three roles, if we can convince them as a family, to have a better family health. There we can start. Family planning has been historically alienated, and it's something where something is being forcefully introduced based on different agenda at different platforms. But ultimately, at the end of the day, why they want men? Why they want boys? Because that will be more hands at work. They will be earning more. Girls are for other house. These kind of cultural aspects need to be actually dealt into the program. Definitely supply, quality of care will remain there. But we need to think and talk more about the benefit that family planning brings to the family as an unit. Our, his, her will come later. That's from the ground.
So I would like to just touch on your question of the so what. And I would think here, why do we care about family planning? What is good about family planning? It isn't the exercise of using family planning that makes it a good thing. It's what it provides you. The reproductive control, the ability to control your life in many different ways. And for women in particular, it's their body. They have control over their bodily autonomy. So why not measure that? Like, why do we care about modern contraceptive prevalence? Why don't we just measure feelings of reproductive control and bodily autonomy and satisfaction with your reproductive life? Those are things that family planning is a tool to get us to the point, but we are not measuring the outcomes that we really should be. So if I was saying, if we're really focusing on empowerment, I think my so what and what I would like to see happening more in the future is much less focus on indicators that focus on these little easy to measure outcomes of modern contraceptive use or number of condoms distributed by the clinic, and are much more focused on why we really care about those things. What do we want to enhance people's reproductive lives with, and measure that. And it's not easy, you know, and it's complicated because you have two people in a relationship, and perhaps by empowering one, you're disempowering the other. Those are complicated questions. We, as a field, need to just grapple with it instead of standing back and saying, gosh, it's so complicated. Like, that's not an excuse for not dealing with it. And so where I would like to see us go in terms of the so what is, if we really care about empowerment and we believe that reproductive empowerment is a distinct and important, and I think absolutely critical aspect of overall empowerment, then we need to take it seriously and really measure outcomes that are related to empowerment, not some sort of intermediate step towards that.
I love that answer. That was very similar, but far more eloquent than the answer I was going to give, which is, but I'm still going to give it. No, I'll be brief, just to say, I think we're all interested in identifying what our goal is. And I think the field has recognized that our goal is not modern contraceptive use. And if that's how we're always defining the goal, we're never going to get past that. And we're always going to be hamstrung by a history of abuse in our field. And we're never going to have a good answer to the naysayers. And what we need to do then is to develop measures that reflect what our goal is. But I think often we point to the problem with our measures without actually describing what our re-envisioned goal is. And that's where I loved your answer, Jeff, because I think a re-envisioned goal of reproductive empowerment, of which agency is a key part, if we're able to define that goal, then the measurement community can come back and tell you how to measure it. But as a community, we first have to land on that. And I think that we can push from behind, which is what a lot of sort of what we're presenting here is that actually there are different pieces of agency that aren't reflected in contraceptive use. And if we can start to see that in the data, then we can also help push the conversation from behind. So I really appreciate.
So one very brief question which I forgot to ask you. Is there agency in non-use?
Yes.
Is that the conclusion of your?
Yes, there is agency in non-use, but all non-users don't have agency. So that is not the point of this research, is to say that non-users have agency. No. But the engagement, the active engagement in the decision not to use can very well be an indication of agency. And so let's not conflate those things, but let's recognize that there's a lot of different ways in which agency presents itself. And I think that's what a lot of us have, all of us have shown here today.
Okay, so thank you, panelists. This was wonderful, and I just want to conclude, like for me, some of the takeaways that I'd like to, and I'm sorry there were many of you who could have talked and who have a lot of experience. This is a very limited time, so continue to engage with us otherwise. But to really say that measurement has to shadow the program, and the programs have to shadow measurement, right? So we have to constantly iterate. If we are learning something complicated and new about decision making, it really behooves us to influence the programs. And then as we do more adaptive programs, as you said, we need to measure newer ways of engaging with the ideas of agency, and not just agency, power, and all kinds of dynamics, gender and other kind of power asymmetries, inclusive of a lot of issues that we've been talking in other sessions, such as provider discretion, provider bias. So we've only touched on one set of issues here. But for all those other issues, there's been a lot of work that has been done on almost innovating and creating new measures, whether it's on quality of care, whether it's on provider bias, whether it's on spousal communication, reproductive autonomy. So there's a lot more out there than this panel could focus on. But the idea is that we are constantly trying to disrupt kind of more mainstream ways of doing measurements so that programs can also be more innovative in their approaches. So I think that's how I'd like to conclude. And what you just said in the end, that not everybody who uses has agency, and not lack of or non-use doesn't mean you don't have agency. So agency is also something which we have to understand is a very complicated, contextual, and dynamic construct. So that's it. Thank you, panelists, and thank you, audience.